They say there are no coincidences in geopolitics, only operations. And what we witnessed just hours ago, the alleged drone swarm targeting Vladimir Putin's private residence in Valdai, is not an act of war. It is an act of desperation. It is the final twitching nerve of a dying system. Just yesterday, the world watched as Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky concluded what history will likely record as the surrender summit. The rhetoric was softened. The victory plan was dead. The Western media, for the first time in 3 years, began to utter the forbidden word, negotiation. The ink was practically drying on a deal that would freeze the conflict, shatter the NATO expansionist dream, and officially mark the end of the unipolar American moment. The peace deal was inevitable. The panic in London, Brussels, and the deep corridors of Washington was palpable. And then, miraculously, just as the phone lines were being cleared for the historic Trump-Putin call to finalize the terms, a swarm of suicide drones appears over the Russian president's residence. Ask yourself, cui bono, who benefits? Does Ukraine benefit from poking the bear in the eye right when they are begging for security guarantees? Does Zelensky benefit from humiliating the very Russian leader he now needs to sign a document to save his remaining territory? No. This attack serves only one master, the escalation ladder. This is the U-2 incident of 2025. Just as the deep state sabotaged President Eisenhower's peace summit with Khrushchev in 1960 by sending a spy plane over Russia at the precise wrong moment, the entrenched war machine today has played its final card. They are trying to force Putin's hand. They are praying for a Russian tactical nuclear response. They are begging for an escalation so severe that it makes Trump's peace deal political suicide. We are witnessing the most dangerous moment in modern history. This is not about defending democracy. It is about protecting the grift. For decades, the U.S. establishment, the empire of chaos, has operated on a simple algorithm. When you are losing control, create chaos. When diplomacy fails to serve your hegemony, burn the table. To understand this reckless provocation, we must look at the historical precedent. This is the Monroe Doctrine inverted. The United States has spent 2 centuries claiming the right to overthrow governments in its hemisphere, from the Bay of Pigs to the coups in Chile, under the guise of national security. Yet when the tables turn, when the multipolar world rises to say enough, the empire does not reflect. It lashes out. What happened at Valdai is not a military strategy. It is a frantic attempt to derail history. The neoconservatives and the liberal interventionists know that if Trump and Putin speak, if the guns go silent, the audit begins. The hundreds of billions of dollars, the hollowed out European economies, the lies about Russian weakness, it all collapses. They would rather risk nuclear annihilation than face the irrelevance of their own worldview. But here is the cold, hard reality they're refusing to see. The sabotage didn't work. The fact that we are even discussing this peace deal proves that the old mechanism of control is broken. The strike on Putin's residence wasn't a show of strength. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a tantrum. And as we peel back the layers of this event, we will see that it exposes something far more terrifying than war. It exposes the utter loss of control by the West. The pilot is asleep, and the machine is flying itself into the mountain. The mountain represents the absolute limit of coercive power, and the United States has finally hit the wall. To understand why the deep state is panicked enough to risk World War III over a drone strike in Valdai, you have to understand what this peace deal actually signifies. It is not just a diplomatic agreement, it is an admission of systemic failure. The peace summit was forced upon the West, not by conscience, but by the collapse of their primary weapon, the illusion of omnipotence. For 3 years, we were sold a narrative that was mathematically impossible. We were told that sanctions would turn the ruble to rubble. We were told that excluding Russia from SWIFT would act as a financial nuclear weapon that would bring the Kremlin to its knees within weeks. We were told that the combined GDP of the G7 was an insurmountable force that would crush the Russian economy like a tin can. But look at the reality on the ground today. The Russian economy has not only survived, it is overheated with growth. They are manufacturing artillery shells at a rate that NATO combined cannot match. The sanctions regime did not isolate Russia, it isolated the West. This is the failure of the dollar weaponization mechanism. The United States establishment made a fatal strategic error. They believed that the global financial system was a leash they could yank whenever a nation disobeyed orders. They forgot that if you choke a man long enough, he learns to breathe through his skin. Russia didn't just endure the sanctions, they circumvented the entire architecture of Western financial control. They built the shadow fleet to move their oil. They utilized the yuan. They leveraged the hunger of the global south, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the rising giants of Africa who refused to starve their own populations just to satisfy Washington's moral crusades. The drone attack on Putin's residence is a desperate attempt to obscure this economic defeat. The neocons in Washington are terrified because the world is watching. If the United States throws everything it has short of direct nuclear war at a nation, and that nation is still standing, still growing, and still dictating terms 3 years later, then the empire is naked, the sanctions stick is broken. This circumvention has created a panic in the U.S. Treasury and the Pentagon that is far more severe than any battlefield loss in Donbass. They are witnessing the real-time acceleration of BRICS not just as a talking shop, but as a functioning alternative economic ecosystem. When Zelensky stood next to Trump, looking defeated, he wasn't just mourning the loss of territory, he was the living symbol of a failed investment. The West poured hundreds of billions of dollars into a proxy, and that proxy was ground down by a nation that simply opted out of the Western rules-based order. This is why the sabotage happened now. The establishment cannot afford for the war to end on these terms because these terms acknowledge that the multipolar world has arrived. A negotiated settlement now validates Russia's resistance. It tells China, Iran, and every nation in the global south that the United States is no longer the hegemon that can destroy you with the stroke of a pen. It tells them that resilience works. It tells them that if you can survive the initial shockwave of American wrath, there is a whole world waiting to trade with you on the other side. The panic we are seeing, the frantic drone strikes, the leaked intelligence, the media hysteria, is the reaction of a system that realizes its control panel has been disconnected. The leverage is gone. They tried to bankrupt Putin, and instead, they bankrupted the German industrial base. They tried to isolate Moscow, and instead, they drove Saudi Arabia and Iran into the same room. The mechanism of control has backfired in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. But the most dangerous aspect of this failure is not economic, it is psychological. An empire that knows it is losing its economic grip becomes incredibly volatile militarily. When the dollar stops working as a weapon, they reach for the tomahawks. The deep state knows that once the peace deal is signed, the narrative control evaporates. They will have to explain to the American taxpayer why inflation is rampant, why their energy costs are up, and why their government spent a fortune to achieve absolutely nothing. This circumvention of American power is the Suez moment of the 21st century. Just as the British Empire realized in 1956 that it could no longer act without American permission, the American empire is realizing in 2025 that it can no longer act without the permission of reality. The rest of the world has moved on. The global south is not listening to the lectures from the State Department anymore. They saw the hypocrisy, they saw the theft of Russian sovereign assets, and realized their money wasn't safe either. The peace deal that Trump and Putin are about to discuss is merely the formal recognition of a shift that has already happened. The unipolar moment died in the mud of Avdiivka, and no amount of drone swarms over Valdai can resurrect it. The Washington elite are trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They believe their own propaganda. They believed that history had ended and that liberal democracy was the only operating system the world would ever accept. They failed to account for national sovereignty. They failed to account for the fact that Russia views this war as existential, while for the West, it was just another project, another quarterly report to manage. And now that the project is failing, now that the circumvention is complete, they are left with only two choices: accept a humiliating peace that reshapes the global order, or burn the house down. The attack on the residents suggests there are factions within the CIA and NATO who have chosen the fire. They are terrified that peace will expose their incompetence. They need the war to continue because the war covers their tracks. It hides the fact that the emperor has no clothes, no ammunition, and increasingly, no friends. And beneath the panic, beneath the failed sanctions and the desperate drone strikes, lies the ugliest truth of all. The United States has fallen into its own moral trap. For 30 years, the Washington establishment has operated under a cloak of supreme moral virtue. They told us, and they told themselves, that American intervention was a force for good. They bombed nations to save them. They organized coups to restore democracy. They sanctioned starving populations to protect human rights. But the drone strike on Valdai, timed precisely to murder a peace deal, rips that cloak away for good. We are staring into the moral vacuum of the post-Cold War empire. The rules-based international order we hear so much about is, and always has been, a scam. It is a set of handcuffs for the rest of the world and a license to kill for the West. Look at the graveyard of American interventionism. We don't need to speculate. We have the receipts. Look at Iraq. In 2003, we were told that Saddam Hussein was the ultimate evil, a madman with weapons of mass destruction who threatened a civilized world. The deep state mobilized the entire media apparatus to sell this lie. And what was the result? 1 million Iraqis dead, a nation shattered into sectarian fragments. And the oil? The oil flowed west. The democracy they promised arrived in the form of ISIS, chaos, and generational trauma. They didn't liberate Iraq, they liquidated it. Look at Libya. This is perhaps the most damning indictment of the Western moral compass. Muammar Gaddafi had faults, but he maintained a sovereign, stable nation with the highest standard of living in Africa. He proposed a gold-backed African currency that would have freed the continent from the French and American banking cartels. And for that crime, the crime of economic sovereignty, he was brutally murdered under the cover of a NATO humanitarian mission. Hillary Clinton laughed on live television. We came, we saw, he died. And what is Libya today? It is not a democracy. It is an open-air slave market. It is a fractured ruin ruled by warlords. The West destroyed a functioning state to steal its resources and prevent it from rising, leaving behind a moral carcass that still rots in the Mediterranean sun. And now, look at Ukraine. Do not for 1 second believe the tears shed by Western diplomats for the Ukrainian people. If they cared about Ukrainians, they would have implemented the Minsk agreement 7 years ago. If they cared about Ukrainian lives, they would have allowed the peace deal in Istanbul in April 2022, which Boris Johnson, acting as the messenger for the Anglo-American elite, scuttled immediately. They do not care about Ukraine. To the geopolitical realists in Washington, Ukraine is not a country, it is a battering ram. It is a disposable tool used to degrade Russian power. They are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, not because they believe in Kyiv's freedom, but because they believe in Moscow's destruction. They have lured Zelensky into the same trap they set for Saddam and Gaddafi, the promise of Western protection that vanishes the moment the utility cost becomes too high. This is the moral trap. The United States has weaponized the concept of democracy itself. They use high-minded rhetoric to disguise the basest forms of resource extraction and geopolitical maneuvering. But the trap has snapped shut on their own fingers. The global South is watching. When the U.S. State Department lectures African or Asian leaders on human rights today, those leaders look at Gaza. They look at the Donbass. They look at the smoking ruins of Tripoli, and they see the hypocrisy. They see that human rights is just a label the West applies to its enemies and ignores for its friends. The sabotage of the Trump-Putin peace initiative is the ultimate proof of this moral bankruptcy. A true peacemaker, a true leader of the free world, would celebrate the end of bloodshed. They would welcome a phone call that stops the slaughter of young men in the mud. But instead, the establishment is horrified. They are terrified of peace because peace removes the pretext for control. Peace stops the money laundering. Peace forces them to look in the mirror. This escalation at Valdai proves that the Western elites would rather risk a nuclear holocaust than admit they were wrong. It is a pathology. They are like a gambler who has lost the house, the car, and the savings, and is now trying to bet his children's lives on one final spin of the wheel. There is no morality here. There is only the cold, hard calculus of power preservation. The tragedy is that the American people themselves are victims of this fraud. The average American does not want to police the world. They do not want their tax dollars funding pensions in Kyiv while their own bridges collapse and their own borders dissolve. The deep state has hijacked the moral authority of the American nation and sold it off for parts to the military-industrial complex. They have turned the city on a hill into a fortress of paranoia. We are witnessing the inevitable consequences of coercion over cooperation. You cannot bomb the world into liking you. You cannot sanction the world into obedience. Eventually, the victims band together. Eventually, the lies stop working. The moral trap is that by trying to act as the world's judge, jury, and executioner, the United States has become the world's greatest source of instability. And as we move to the next phase of this analysis, we will see how this moral failure is triggering a global reckoning, a blowback that will reshape the map forever. The world is not just watching, they are preparing. Newton's third law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. In physics, this is undeniable. In geopolitics, it is catastrophic. The drone strike on Valdai, intended as a tactical provocation to disrupt a peace deal, has triggered a strategic landslide. The deep state in Washington is playing checkers, moving pieces on a board they think they control, while the rest of the world is playing three-dimensional chess. We have now entered the phase of global reckoning. The era of consequence-free intervention is over. For decades, the United States could destabilize a region, bomb Belgrade, invade Afghanistan, fracture Syria, and the chaos would stay over there. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were moats that protected the American homeland from the fallout of its foreign policy. But in the age of asymmetric warfare, the oceans have evaporated. The blowback is no longer local, it is global, and it is immediate. What the West fails to grasp is that Russia is not fighting this war alone. They are the vanguard of a massive, coordinated realignment. When the U.S. escalates, it forces Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea into a tighter, more lethal embrace. We are seeing the formation of a block of necessity. Every time Washington uses the dollar as a weapon or NATO as a hammer, it welds this block closer together. This is asymmetric warfare. In its purest form, the United States spends nearly $1 trillion a year on defense, aircraft carriers, F-35 jets, massive bases. But the enemies of this hegemony have realized they don't need to match that spending to defeat it. They don't need to build a navy to fight the U.S. Navy. They just need cheap hypersonic missiles that can sink a carrier for a fraction of the cost. They don't need to control the global banking system. They just need to create a parallel mechanism for energy trade that renders the dollar irrelevant. The response to the Western escalation is already happening, but it's not on the battlefield in Ukraine. It is in the arteries of the global economy. Russia and China are responding by systematically dismantling the pillars of Western prosperity. Look at the commodities markets. Look at the rare earth minerals essential for the technology sector. The global South controls the resources the West needs to function. If the deep state insists on total war, the response will be a resource strangulation that will make the inflation of the last few years look like a mild inconvenience. This is the hidden cost of the Valdai provocation. By proving that the West cannot be trusted to negotiate, by proving that they will sabotage their own peace deals, the U.S. has signaled to Beijing that diplomacy is dead. China is watching this desperation and taking notes. They see a distracted, overextended America depleting its stockpiles in a proxy war it cannot win. This accelerates the timeline for Taiwan. It accelerates the timeline for the expulsion of U.S. forces from the Middle East. The drone strike didn't show strength, it exposed the West's jugular. And let's talk about the domestic consequences, the part the mainstream media refuses to cover. This geopolitical recklessness is a direct threat to the national security of the United States itself. You cannot fight a multi-front war against the world's largest commodity producer and the world's largest factory, China, while your own industrial base is rusted out and your debt is spiraling out of control. The deep state is writing checks that the American economy cannot cash. They are risking hyperinflation to fund a stalemate. They are prioritizing the borders of Ukraine while the U.S. southern border remains a chaotic turnstile. This is the definition of imperial overstretch. The Roman Empire didn't fall because it was conquered from the outside. It fell because it hollowed itself out from the inside, spending its blood and treasure on distant wars while the core rotted away. We are seeing reciprocal escalation on a terrifying scale. If the U.S. provides long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia, what happens when Russia provides advanced anti-ship missiles to the Houthis in Yemen? What happens when Russian electronic warfare technology starts showing up in the hands of cartels or insurgencies hostile to U.S. interests? Two can play this game. The United States has lived in a bubble where it sends weapons but never receives the consequences. That bubble has burst. The Valdai attack forces the Russians to take the gloves off. Until now, Putin has actually been fighting with restraint, treating this as a special military operation. But if the West signals that the goal is the assassination of the leadership and the disintegration of the Russian state, Moscow will have no choice but to broaden the conflict. This is the nightmare scenario. The deep state is pushing a nuclear superpower into a corner where its only option is total mobilization. This global reckoning is not just about maps changing colors. It represents the transfer of wealth, influence, and future potential from the West to the East. The peace deal that Trump and Putin were about to sign was an off-ramp. It was a chance for the U.S. to cut its losses, pivot, and rebuild. By sabotaging it, the establishment has floored the accelerator toward the cliff. They are betting everything on the idea that Russia will crack. But look at history. Look at Napoleon. Look at Hitler. Russia does not crack under pressure. It hardens. And this time, it has the backing of the entire global majority. It did not end with a grand treaty or a decisive battle. It is ending in the pathetic whir of drones over Valdai and the frantic whispers of bureaucrats terrified of losing their relevance. The events of the last 24 hours are the final spasms of a hegemon that refuses to accept the world has changed. The choice facing the United States establishment was simple: adapt to reality or cling to the illusion. Adapting would mean humility. It would mean accepting a multipolar world where Washington is a partner, not a master. It would mean recognizing that security is indivisible, that you cannot have security for NATO at the expense of security for Russia. It would mean retreating from the edges of the empire to heal the rot at the core. But the attack on Putin's residence confirms that the deep state has chosen the illusion. They have chosen to double down on the myth of exceptionalism, the religious belief that the United States is chosen by providence to rule the earth, and that any nation defying this rule is not just a strategic rival, but a moral abomination. This myth is the most dangerous narcotic in history. It blinds leaders to consequences. It allows them to believe that they can sabotage a peace deal between two nuclear powers and simply walk away. But the sun is setting. The unipolar moment was a historical anomaly, a brief window between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the BRICS. That window is now shut. The tragedy is that the West had every opportunity to lead this new world through cooperation. Instead, they chose coercion, and now they face isolation. The saboteurs may have delayed the phone call between Trump and Putin, but they cannot delay the inevitable. The forces of history are stronger than the schemes of the CIA or the panic strategies of the neocons. The global south continues to rise. The dollar continues to weaken. The patience of the American people continues to fray. This war will end. All wars do. But how it ends will define the next century. Will it end with a handshake and a new security architecture that respects sovereignty? Or will it end in the radioactive ash of a conflict triggered by men who would rather rule a graveyard than share the world? The drone strike was their vote for the graveyard. Now, the rest of the world gets a vote, and the message from the global majority is clear. The empire is naked, the emperor is delusional, and the time for illusions is over. If you refuse to be spoon-fed the sanitized narrative of the mainstream media, if you want to understand the mechanics of power behind the headlines, you need to subscribe to this channel. We do not sell you hope. We show you the map. Hit the like button to signal to the algorithm that you demand the truth. And share this video with someone who still thinks this war is about democracy. I want to hear your analysis in the comments below. Answer me this. First, do you believe the deep state would genuinely risk a tactical nuclear exchange just to prevent Donald Trump from signing a peace deal with Putin? Second, is this drone attack the final gasp of the war or the beginning of a new, darker phase of sabotage inside Russia itself? The history books are being written right now. Make sure you are on the right side of the truth.